Sorry guys, I need to about pass around until down.
Okay.
And we'll just leave the belt back around and just kick off. Thank you very much. Alright. Good morning everyone and welcome to round 4 of Glasgow Youth 24. Congratulations on all making it this far. Now my name is Rob, I'll be your chair today. He is good. I'm joined by quite a large number today, so let them introduce themselves from my left to my right.
Hi, my name is Euro. Good luck.
I'm Lara, she here. And Stephen, please go on the room.
Fantastic. Alright, so we're going on to introduction now. Need your name, speaking position and opponent if you'd like so. Let me begin today, Durham A.
Dia speaking first, she, her pronouns, please.
Thank you. Opening opposition, EUDC.
Esme, she is speaking first.
And Tom, you ready, please?
Thank you. And closing government Tribune B.
First will be speaking Piotr, no preferred pronouns, and second speaking Adriana, she, her place.
Thank you. And lastly, closing opposition Belgrade B.
Lago speaks first, no preferred pronouns, and Mikhail speaks second, no preferred pronouns. Good luck with that one.
Fantastic. Right, now as far as I'm aware, speaking times haven't changed since last round, so we're up to 7 minutes long. Bells will sound like this. 1 at 1, 1 at 6, 2 at 7, 3 at 7:15. Please take and ask POIs in the uncorrected time. Please stop talking after the time's elapsed. Other than that, most of the house today is in hybrid regime. This house as an independent news media company would actively be biased against the ruling party rather than being impartial, like the Prime Minister to begin the debate. Here.
So I told you to sit so I was speaking into this microphone. Or is the recording not hooked up?
I think it'd be fine to stand. You guys tech guys?
We're just observing.
No worries then. I assume it'd be fine.
Maybe get the microphone to be short.
I don't think it's going on, so I think it's fine.
It's
No,
just
it's
recording.
just for aesthetics.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of pieces of characterization right at the top of my speech. What do these regimes look like, and what do these news organizations look like, and what are their incentives? First, these regimes. Obviously, there are some democratic elements to these countries. Some officials are elected democratically, but there's also like executive orders and things like this, legislation that goes out that has nothing to do with any sort of like democratic processes. So there's still a lot of autocratic elements. Crucially, that these hybrid regimes appear just like as pretty autocratic to other countries, because countries that have some democratic elements but are not full-fledged democracies are genuinely considered like on the world stage as non-democratic countries. That's very important. Second, what are these news organizations' incentives? We think there are two things. First, profit, and second, legacy. Profit, we think that this is pretty intuitive. All news organizations want to be making like the best news that gets the best attention, that has the most people tuning in, to get the most money, be able to pay their workers better, be able to make better news, etc. I'll talk about that more later. But second, their legacy, it's not time yet. We think that news organizations want to be remembered for like having the best journalism, having the best stories, being able to make the biggest changes in their countries. We think those are the two things that news organizations want the most: profit and a good legacy. Right. going on from there then, what do we know about autocracies or these hybrid regimes that appear as autocracies to other nations? Autocracies, notably, are very, very volatile. That is to say that they are unpredictable, and democratic states do not know how they are going to behave. What democratic states, notably like Western democratic states, want from these autocratic regimes is for them to democratize for a few reasons. First, because then these Western countries are able to get more influence and power over them. They're able to trap them into things like better trade deals for themselves. We think the West wants to exploit these things and take advantage of them, and so they actively have a vested interest in these countries democratizing so that they are able to improve their relationship with them, get more trade out of them, get like a better control of the world stage in these ways, etc. No thank you. Because of that then, and because the West wants these countries to democratize, we think that they are likely to fund independent news organizations who are against the ruling party more than they would a news organization that is independent. This is because whichever ruling party is in power in this like hybrid regime obviously isn't taking the autocratic elements away, right? They're keeping them in check, they're keeping them in place, and so they're like a relatively autocratic regime in that sense. We think that any like Western place would want them to democratize more. That means that they're more likely to fund these news organizations if they're taking an active stance against them and making it like very, very obvious to their watchers, no, like I keep waving you down, no, we want these regimes to democratize, I've already said no, please put your hand down, and we want these things to like change, right? That's why this funding is probably going to come through. Not just those Western democracies though, we think things like liberal think tanks, NGOs, who want to be able to claim that they played a role in democratizing autocratic regimes, who want to be seen as like a savior, as a hero to the world, who are like changing these nations for the better, etc. We think that they're likely to be like funneling money into these news organizations to say, look, you should be like shit-talking these regimes on TV, get everybody to galvanize and say, no, this is not okay, this is not democratic, so that they can claim that they played a role. We funded the news organization that outed all this autocratic stuff, etc. Now, we think that opposition is likely to come up here and say, but these news organizations are largely putting themselves at risk, right? What if things are going to happen to them? What if journalists get shot? What if they go to prison, etc.? We think that this would actually be a good thing for a couple reasons. First, if these autocratic regimes actively go after these news organizations that are being backed by the West, this makes it increasingly obvious to the rest of the world which parts of the regime are autocratic and which parts are undemocratic and violent towards their citizens. We think that any time that the government retaliates against their citizens, if they have all of this backing, which we prove that they're likely to because of the incentives of the West to democratize these nations, then it's probably more likely to be the case that if the government retaliates against these news organizations, more people are going to see it, there's more backing from the West and more vested interest in what happens to them, and also there's more protection for these news organizations as well. So if that government decides to retaliate against them, now we've got all these vested interests from think tanks, NGOs, etc. that can also go in and say that they had a vested interest in those companies and it was them directly and their investments that was hurt by that government.
But we can also critique the government. They often do bad things, undemocratic things, by being impartial.
Yeah, sure, okay, fine. But I think the problem with this is that the impartiality part of this, right, is that if an autocratic regime is passing legislation or whatever that isn't necessarily harmful to the people, but it's still non-democratic, then the organization is going to say, oh, well, this piece of legislation was passed today. We think it's much better to have a news organization that's actively biased against any regime that keeps autocratic systems in check and say anything that they do is bad, regardless of whether it helps our country or not, because they refuse to democratize the nation, and that in and of itself is worse than any other benefit that they could give us. That's why we think it's better to always be biased against them, because for exactly this reason, just because they might not be doing things that are actively harming their citizens, it's still bad because they're not democratic, and so to be actively biased against everything they do, to highlight the fact that they're not democratic, is going to be more useful for these news organizations to be able to do those things, like drawing the funding, like drawing the legacy. But second, all of this then that was about funding, why they're likely to get more funding from the West, NGOs, governments, think tanks, etc. But the second thing is their legacy, right? We think that people who work for news organizations generally want to do good journalism, want to do good reporting, and want to give out good news. We think that this profit that they're likely to get if they choose to be biased against the actively regime party, is probably going to allow them to create better news and allow them to boost up their legacy more. Because the more funding that these news organizations are going to be able to get, the better journalism they can achieve, like the better journalism they can hire, the better news articles they can write, the better like production they can have, right? All of this leads to the legacy of the news organization being stronger overall. And like, if they can claim later down the line that it was them and their company that was able to show the autocratic holes in their government, that was able to prove how often they retaliate against people who like censor them, then that's when we think that these news organizations are going to have a much better legacy, are probably going to even be able to like draw out even more funding and things like this. So as the organization itself, with the profits or with the incentives of profit and legacy, it makes far more sense for them to be actively biased against an autocratic regime, so they're able to constantly poke holes in the regime, saying it doesn't matter what they do, even if it's good for the country, because they're not democratic, and that in and of itself is the greatest evil we can have. We think they're likely to get backing from the West, which achieves their incentives of profit, and which allows them to achieve their goals of having a good legacy. Very, very proud to be.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, I'll just move up to the case for, here.
Starting the speech in 3, 2, 1. The other part of victory is this. Reporting biasly doesn't lead to better news, or in the worst case, it does in the short term, but it endangers the existence of that independent news media company forever until you don't get better news in the long run. Right. Key mitigation of why you're very likely to just be shut down on government. EUDC says that the West wants like Turkey and Hungary to democratize, and so they fund these independent news media companies. Now there's lots of reasons why this is ridiculous, but I think that they just genuinely failed, right? And they also they won't let them join the EU, so it's not exactly a particularly pressing thing. But I think a lot of these nations are backsliding towards authoritarianism. What this looks like is these governments change their laws when they want to so that it works in their favor. They gerrymander, so they change how their constituencies can vote, so they get greater votes in certain constituencies that are that work in their favor. So maybe voting out favors religious people and therefore get the religious people, right? This means that they're still democratic, but they have quite a lot of power to be not. It looks like they revoke independence from other bodies that track them, such as their central banks, and it's unclear whether or not their elections are actually free and fair. This means that they are a dangerous actor, and they are a dangerous actor to the independent news media companies. What does bias against actually mean? Because we haven't heard it from OG. It looks like an ideology that you are opposed to the government. It is an active and constant criticizing of the government. Because no, on opposition we can still report on the fact that our government is doing bad things, because that is an impartial take of something that is objectively true. It is objectively bad for a democratic nation to gerrymander, right? But I think when you are actively biased, you are an active and constant threat to the existence of your government. This means that every headline that independent news media takes is about a government mistake. The stories are actively criticizing of all times. It means they probably don't interview people within the government and talk to them and have them on TV. It means they're all of these things, right? I think that one of these things is true is that hybrid regimes also are able to do good things. This means that your news media company is limited in the scope of the news that it's able to create, because it won't report on things like that, right? But I think it also means that there is a real basis for you to be criticized, both by the government, other media, and also the people reading, right? This is really important because especially for politically moderate readers, who you probably are able to reach when you report impartially. So when you're able to say that Erdogan is doing some dirty things here and here, I think the only way in which you get religious individuals in Turkey who favor Erdogan because he's a religious leader in a state that is meant to be secular is if you are able to position yourself as an impartial news source. Otherwise, it's very easy for those politically moderate readers to forget about it, to write you up as this biased, crazy, independent news source. I think this is really important when we talk about which readers we actually want to be reading. Because I think on both sides we probably have a small group of base level supporters who read left-wing news or right-wing news. But I think it's important that we capture the middle ground news if you're wanting to fulfill your job as being an informative institution. I think you're much more likely to not be shut down. I mean, you're much more likely to be shut down if you're a biased, right? This is because authoritarian organizations pissed off. Right? This means that they put a lot of money into being able to have big surveillance. This means that even if you go underground, which you think might be an extension from government, you become an underground bias paper. This is bad because they usually have to operate online. I think it's very easy for institutions to have their domains shut down, to have their access to printing and distribution targeted. Journalists get targeted and thrown in prison on bullshit charges that maybe have some grounding because you are an actively biased threat against the government. I think Tom is going to deal with that in time. I think what happens, however, when you are impartial is you can act politically strategically. Right? This means that you can report when your state does something that is actively bad, and it's obvious that it's actively bad, but maybe not obvious to the people within your active nation. Right? But then for each critical piece you release, you can also release a somewhat complementary piece, right? So you can be Erdogan is really bad at making financial decisions for Turkey, but he did give the central bank back some of its independence, and that is a good thing. And that means that you are less of an active threat, and you also, it's also just a more well-rounded view of what's actually happening in your country. Because media and news is meant to be impartial. I think it's generally just accepted that it's a truth-seeking exercise. And this is really important because it's taught in journalism school, but it's also the metric by which a media company is evaluated to be good. This is important for two reasons. One, when you are seen as a proper truth-seeking media organization, you gain credibility from the informed readers in your country. These are the readers who financially support the independent paper. They give you sponsorships. They protect you from being shut down because they're actually business people with lobbying power in the government. OG says it's the West that funds these independent news media organizations. That is not true. I don't know why they would do that. They can fund their own news companies. Note that journalists don't get paid very much, even here in the UK, right? Also, a better way to make Hungary or Turkey more democratic is probably just to fund the opposition party within that country. I don't know why you indirectly go and fund an independent, shitty, tiny news media organization. I think the way small media organizations fund themselves is via kickstarting. They run GoFundMes. They try and reach out to people who want to be informed within their country. I'll take over.
Okay, so there's already existing biases that autocracies suck, right? So the second you report something impartial, will they still want to shut you down?
I don't think that's what impartial means, right? I think that you have to prove that through being able to report impartially means that you also have to report in the way in which your government is biased. I think a lot of journalists can see that the government is doing bad things, and they think that that is the way in which you judge impartially. I think you can't be to do impartial is to do what the government says. I think that's crazy. Okay, I think the second thing is that you are able to gain credibility internationally when you're an impartial news source. Note that the West quite likes reading Al Jazeera because we view it as an impartial news source in the East. Right? I think this is two reasons why this is good. One, because if you're not impartial, other journalists investigate you from around the world. Two, other bigger international multinational media companies like the BBC or the CNN or the Sky, who are also impartial and probably report impartially in your country too because they don't have political ideologies. They just want to tell the British what's going on. Right? Probably run less joint stories with you. They probably want to work with you less. They endorse you less, and this makes you less able to function. Right? So I think you're comparatively protected under impartiality. But what are the incentives of this company? One, I think to the livelihoods of their own self and their own staff. I think when you actively place your journalists in danger, both physically but also just via their careers, because you're probably unable to move between your company after you've been blacklisted for being a political agent, right? So even if government is right and says that it's good to martyr journalists, I don't think the journalists would agree with that, and I think they would probably opt out. The second thing is you care about providing good news, right? It is not our priority to create governmental change as an independent news company. We are not a social movement. Our main priority is to be instructional, otherwise we would just be a social movement. This means we're not anti-establishment, we just want to be informative. I think when active bias limits the scope of your reporting, it means you can't interview government employees when they have pro-biases towards your government. It means that you actively limit the ability for you to be informative. I think you care about your resistance into the future, and so it's important that you're a long-lasting news source that is able to be credible.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now deep enough in case we'll be opening government here.
extraneous responses before I move on to the next section. I'm going to start off with the thing that came out last, or like the most recent thing that we heard from all, which is this idea essentially of how you want this sort of truth-seeking idea because it harms your existence in the future because you don't want to lose your credibility. Or essentially this idea of loss of credibility when you give impartial news. I don't think that's true for a number of reasons. Firstly, a lot of people do like this sort of sensationalized type of news, and I think they've kind of mischaracterized the average individual who consumes news right now. I think a lot of people like sensationalization, on top of the fact that people are already polarized. The world is increasingly polarizing, and I think the trends are showing to be increasingly polarizing as well, which means people want a sensationalized idea of what they already want to consume, which is why you choose your subscriptions, which is why people who subscribe to fucking The Economist or New York Times don't subscribe to things like Fox News, right? Essentially, you are already stuck in these polarized worlds, and you choose to consume the news you want. So it's actually an act of consumption, consuming what you want. I don't necessarily think this harms you as much as they think it does. But secondly, the more important response is, they've mischaracterized where this debate is taking place. Because I don't think these media news companies are being harmed for being biased in states that are not democratic. Yes, maybe in a democratic state, if you are seen as being, someone who makes fake news or someone who is not impartial, yes, there's a lot of stigmatization. But in nations where you are seen as being a part of autocratic, things like Turkey, places like Pakistan, places like Sri Lanka, there is absolutely no stigma. If anything, you are supported for being biased against any sort of autocratic regime, not just by the West, but by internal people who also want that push for democracy. So I think you are seen as more of a savior as opposed to someone who's actually harmed the process of truth-seeking or whatever. So I think they mischaracterize how your legacy or how it's going to be in terms of truth-seeking, because when the nature of the state that you're going against means that it's seen as an inherent good, irrespective of the means through which it is happening. It is seen as an inherent good because it's a fight for democracy. I don't think any of that material stands. The second thing I want to do here is in terms of the comparative, and these are the things they talk about dangers. They essentially say that this is a dangerous actor, and hence you should report strategically and be impartial. And the consequence or the impact is you're seen as an active harm when biased. I think you're seen as an active harm when impartial as well. Because tell me, this nation, say it's fucking up constantly, are you not going to still, report them because you are impartial? I think the fact that you have the potential to constantly report these people also means that these states are like, oh shit, I can't do this because these guys are impartial, which means they will report me when I do this. So let me get rid of them first before I do this. And this is how these states work. When they want to pass dirty policies, or when they want to undercut, dirty policies, what they essentially do is, okay, let me get rid of this news agency first because I'm going to do this thing, and they know they're impartial, so they know for a fact that these guys are going to report. I think they're more likely to let them live when they're biased or let them exist when they're biased because they can portray to the media as, oh look, another biased media company that's going to exist. But when they have the credibility of being impartial, it's they're going to be like, oh shit, people are actually going to believe what these news agencies say, which is incredibly harmful, which means there's more threat on these people, more threat to the existence on your side of the house. I'm not going to take you there, I'll tell you when I'll take it. Closing. Secondly, I also would like to say that autocracies can't afford, and this is the POI that we asked as well, this second one, autocracies can't afford any reputational harm. The fact is, people already think that a mix or any type of autocratic policies suck. They hate them and they think that they're portrayed as bad by social media, they're portrayed as bad by the West. This is problematic because that means the second even one impartial news piece of news comes out saying that they've done something wrong, they get really panicked and really worried because it confirms a bias that already exists within people. It confirms a bias that already exists within the world. So that means they can't afford one slipper or they can't afford even one. So I think the harm is at most symmetric, at best if anything falls onto our side of the house because these pressures are going to exist either way. But thirdly, and there's a new piece of material that I can do, I think there's a checking mechanism to ensure that these people are protected by the people who are funding them on our side of the house. There may be theories which I'll rebuild in a bit as to why the West has an incentive and think tanks from the West, NGOs from the West, has an incentive to fund resources and fund money into this policy. This means they can give them checking mechanisms and ensure their existence in two ways that can only happen on our side of the house. One, they can actually use their other news agencies to have a spotlight on this news agency to say if they were killed or if they were shut down, we would know and we would find out, which means there's a checking mechanism that exists on our side of the house. This only comes in when you get funding from big, large think tanks that come from the West and big, large NGOs that come from the West. But secondly, it allows them to give them protection resources, things like security, things like that would only come in through funding. Rebuilding our case, and why is this the most important thing? Firstly, I think that it's I'll give you a few reasons why the West always has an incentive for democracies to democratize. There are three reasons for this. One, the West is generally scared of autocracies. That is because autocracies or nations with autocratic rules can do whatever they want whenever they fucking want. They can launch their nukes like we saw in the case of Russia. They can start wars whenever they want like we saw in the Middle East, which means they always have the constant fear of, there's a threat. So they always want to, turn these countries over. But secondly, basically, it makes life a lot easier for them in terms of trade, global politics, the international relations, when these countries are democratic. Because institutions like the United Nations and like the institutions essentially protect trade and regulate these trades and don't let anyone, doesn't let the nature of these autocracies take advantage of them. So there's an incentive for the West in both in terms of safety but also in terms of economics to ensure that these nations are democratic. Why then would they do this through the media agencies that exist within these countries as opposed to their own media agencies, which is the responsibility they get from all? I think they're more likely to do this by funding news agencies that happen within their country, internal country, for a number of reasons. One, they have more credibility within their country in and of itself. The fact that it's an organization that came up within the country means it's literally closer to people, more proximate to people, people who know the people who are in those news agencies, likely to create and value that news a lot more. But also, they have access to local resources. The fact is, they have access to the information that they need to get with regards to, pushing a bias against current regimes, which means it's much easier for the West to turn a regime by funding internal media organizations as opposed to, their own back in the West and reporting based on that. But more importantly, it's the people you need the people you need to flip or the people you need to, instigate to start a regime change are the people within that state. So those are the people you want to directly impact, and that can only happen if you have, funding that comes through internal media organizations. The kicker here essentially is that this has been done and it's true. Example, Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, there was massive funding, I'm from Sri Lanka, so this is, there's massive funding in the thing called Rupavahini. I'm not going to say it. So news agencies that came in by the US to flip the Rajapaksa regime and put the US back, Ranil Wickremesinghe, within power. So these are things that have actually happened in the past. These is a tried and tested way of flipping these regimes. I think this is really important because this means a few things. One, a lot of profit for these companies because they're going to get a lot of funding and funding that only exists in the West. They tell me that their funding is to come from a few rich, really well-educated readers. I don't think there are that many of those right now because of the characterization I gave you regarding polarization. But even then, I think comparatively, get significantly more funding resources and safety from us at the house because there are larger think tanks, larger NGOs, and larger politically backed organizations who are giving you money. I think you get more money, more protection, you live longer, and you stay on a better legacy. Easy to achieve.
Bonjour.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, please. I won't rise or anything. I wanted you guys to mention.
Thank you. Did you do it for the copy? Yeah.
I've had this for 2 years.
I've seen you.
Yeah.
You never.
I was like, why don't we match?
If I try to suggest anything like that, you just switch forward. But you have early section.
Take it off.
Right, there you go, the speech no, the top half you get.
Firstly, let's talk about the risk of shutting down. And I want to be incredibly clear here, because opening government will give a very lazy response where they say probably the incentive to shut down is symmetric because they just don't like news journalism. They probably tangle themselves up in knots where they say, sometimes these smaller or independent news journalists which are against the government aren't that powerful, so the government doesn't care enough to shut them down. But on the other hand, they also talk about how these are so threatening that they're actually going to make some amount of change within the population. I think they probably have to pick one in opening government, but it actually is slightly tense for themselves. The analysis which Esme did, which is very clear, is just it's far more likely to be shut down when you're a journalistic outlet which is active actively against the government. And this is the reason for this is basically that governments have an active incentive to stop dissent within their own country. They don't want their own populations to rise up. Esme tells you that these governments have capacity to do this, importantly, because they already are like gerrymandering, they're already changing laws and constitutions within the country, they're already changing norms. So if they do spot a news outlet which is threatening them, which opening up government's best case are, then that necessarily means they have a very strong incentive and ability to shut them down. But importantly, on our side of the house, I think there's some amount of nuance for why our organisations don't get shut down, because we agree with opening government to an extent that these governments are trying to seem democratic. That's the only reason why they still have elections. That's the only reason why they still have like national polls and things like that, because they probably do want to seem to the international community ostensibly democratic. So that means that necessarily they're not going to shut down organisations which label themselves as being impartial. The thing is, it's about the optics rather than the ability to do this on our side of the house, because the optics of shutting down an organisation which is very, very like explicit at being impartial is much different to the optics of shutting down an organisation which is actively not impartial. Because on their side of the house, they have to stand behind an organisation which is telling the population that they are like a priori against the government, no matter what the government are doing, to be able to get the buy-in. But this is also the reputation which the government is going to put upon this organisation as well. And this is incredibly damaging for these institutions as well, because the narrative then arises, if you are just inherently against the government, then there's literally nothing that the government can do which this organisation isn't going to criticise them for. So that means that it's incredibly damaging for your reputation as a journalist, because no longer are you making up your opinions based on objective facts. You've already decided your opinion, and therefore you're acting on your opinion before you find out the information. This means it's far easier to just literally shut down an organisation which has this reputation preceding them within this country. Now let's importantly weigh the shutdown risk, because we think this is the most important impact in the debate. Firstly, because that means that all of government benches' impacts are like proceeding of this. If you don't have an outlet in the first place, you can't access any impacts which government are talking about. This is the most important response in the debate. But secondly, it's also the thing which these journalistic outlets care about to the greatest extent. We think probably they care about money or reputation to an extent, but probably you care far greater about the livelihoods and the jobs of the colleagues that you work with 24/7. You know them, you know their families, and you know what they're like, and you want to help them out in the first place. You want to avoid at all costs the risk of them being arrested or being sent to jail if that is something which is likely to happen within your country. So even if we're making less money on our side of the house, even if we're biting the bullet that you're less likely to get as big of an international reputation, we're completely fine with that so long as my friends and colleagues are safe in this outlet. The second bit of weighing is on public and international buy-in, because the analysis at the top of this speech talking about why you get a bad reputation also happens for the public as well. Opening government gave a couple pushbacks where they basically say lots of people like scandal, lots of people like polarisation, lots of people are against this government. The issue is, the main way in which this government has gained legitimacy in the first place is that they probably do have some extent of a majority within their population. Maybe they appeal to a large religious majority within their population, or a large sect of people who buy into the government. That's the reason why there aren't mass protests overthrowing the autocratic government. That's the reason why the international community doesn't have a ton of legitimacy to literally just go in and overthrow this government, because there is public buy-in to an extent. So probably the majority, and the powerful majority, are people who disavow of the news outlet on opening government, which means that they're not actually accessing any of the legitimacy that they're talking about. Because as soon as you say to your friends and family that you're reading the news outlet on their side of the house, they say that's just crazy shit, which is like anti the government for no reason, which importantly means you're not getting any sort of respect. But this also transfers internationally as well, because the reputation is something which is incredibly important. An NGO firstly doesn't want to fund an organisation which might be even likely to be shut down, because that would just be a ton of their money chucked in the drain. But also they just like funding organisations which seem impartial, because that's one of the main doctrines of journalism in and of itself. You turn up to journalist school, and the first thing they tell you is to report on the truth and only the truth, because that's just literally the fucking point of journalism. So probably these NGOs have some sort of bias towards organisations which at least brand themselves as being impartial. Now, why are these impartial organisations actually likely to be impartial on our side of the house? Because they say, well, you're likely to. Actually, I'll take a look.
So I think the problem with this case is that it's assuming that you're going to do this in the stupidest kind of way where you're going to continuously antagonize the government. Being biased does not mean you always are going to antagonize the government and that you are able to stretch the rules that you're talking about in that capacity.
Okay, so importantly, this POI is exclusively mitigation, because presumably you're antagonizing the government to a greater extent on our side of the house, and a lesser extent on our side of the house, and every capacity that they have to be sensible and like tactical with your ideology, we also have the same capacity on our side of the house. Every single capacity they have to like sneakily target the government where people perceive it as being impartial is also the capacity that we have on our side of the house. So if your journalists are ideological in that form, then we can do it on our side of the house while still labeling ourselves as being impartial as well, if they really think that that's such a clever idea. But we've told you why that's not a clever idea, to brand yourself as being biased, because you get shut down, and that's really bad. We actually get some amount of impartiality, because probably you do have like a respect for sort of like institutions or change as well as a journalist, right? Presumably you do support the idea of democracy if you literally pursued a career yourself, which is like going into the pursuit of the truth. Presumably you in the past have lived if these countries are backsliding, have lived in an area in which these places aren't actually that undemocratic. So you probably understand what, as a journalist, what being impartial was like in the past. So you understand things which are okay to report on and not. So we think these people are probably sensible about being impartial and aren't just like the government's cronies who report whatever they say as they talk about. I think therefore, let's respond to their last argument on the West funding these organisations. So I think Esme's already talked about this, and they give a couple more examples in the deputy, but I think the inherent incentive isn't there. They say the West has a very large capacity to regulate against backsliding, but my question to opening government then is, how are Poland, Hungary, and Turkey all still backsliding if the West is funding on pouring all this money into these countries in the first place? I think it's just completely unrealistic, counterfactual, that like NGOs are funding all these organisations and companies. It's just completely unrealistic. Oh, you're completely out. Yeah. I just realized that.
Thank you very much for that speech. I think everyone top up. I'll welcome the government member to begin the toast for London government. Here.
Okay, before I start, what's this for the recording? No matter what this weird person in the blue school spawned up there is telling you, you should do debating, you should go have fun, you should give everything every round, and then leave it all behind after the call. Try to play the trace extension, try to play from POIs, and have a lot of fun debating. Please continue doing it. Okay. I prefer my POIs non-verbally. I'll try to engage. Have fun. No, it's not. We'll put that there. At the moment you're going to bias news, you're going to attract way more followers and then you get way more money. You're going to be the first to give structural reasons of why you actually want this money in the first place and how you're going to get it directly engaged with opening up. Why is money the most important thing in this debate? Note that media companies are companies. It means they have boards of directors which are devoted to, for example, investors who want to be able to make returns, but also they want this money to be able to then, for example, grow this company in the first place. But note there are just also other companies that you need to compete against. You need to get the better journalists. Well, oftentimes it's important to have pay because you have high student loans, but also have other responsibilities such as getting a house and family. Which means the moment you're able to give them a higher pay, they're more willing to work more hours and you're more likely to actually get them. But also, you just need this for better stuff, right? You need to have better computing algorithms to be able to, for example, check more data to see if election rules are rigged and that kind of stuff. So you want to have better capacity in the first place. So by the hand of the market, it forces you to actually get this, but also you just need to get capacity in the first place. If you want to do something, you're able to do this way better at the moment you have this money. I think you're going to do this in the way that you want to on either side. So it's not about you want to do this because you want to leave this as well, or you have activistic needs, because at some point you can do whatever you want, but likely you believe that you're going to be the one who's doing this well because you believe that you are the right person to do this. It doesn't matter which specific thing you're doing this, because you believe in yourself. So, why are you not actually going to get shut down directly engaging with opening opposition? So, I want to note that they just say the government can shut this down, but never give any analysis of why they have the capacity to do this. They're talking about large things such as shutting down all like online forums and unable to actually, form together. You're going to have no access to printing and that kind of stuff. That is a huge amount of money and effort and manpower that the government needs to implement over doing any other kind of policy that they might need to do, such as fixing the bugs to get more people to like them or to have a big army. But they also want those, right? Their own analysis is they might have, new pop-ups. It's very hard to have like this stopping this online. It's very hard for big governments to hold these small like online news medias accountable. I don't think Hungary and Bangladesh have that capacity. At that point, it's oftentimes better to have the devil that you know and who you can like have some regulation with, and you can actually sue than actually not have that government. So therefore, you don't want to shut these things down. You don't want to do this hard kind of things. But also note that at the moment you're going to try to shut this down, you're going to get way more attention to this news. Right? This news can now play the victim and now get all of this attention. So therefore, there is this less incentive for the government to do this. But I also want to note, right? You just don't have the capacity. Note you still have autocrats. This means that, for example, you have constitutional judges who want to have free speech or want to actually not go against this. That's to say, you still have accountability mechanism. Parties still change. You still want to not have parties go against you and all of this kind of stuff. So I don't know to what extent you really have the capacity, because they just claim that you are backsliding. Just because you are backsliding doesn't mean you can do everything in a country, because there's still other people who are powerful, who have principles, who have, for example, academically been taught that yes, it is important to have this freedom of speech, yes, we should try to have this accountability, and those are also people in power on their side of the house or in opposition parties trying to get bigger. So, why are you going to get biased, get more readers? I think OO has one point on this. They say you're going to get Western readers. The problem with this is you have a huge competition, right? They're literally talking about themselves. Al Jazeera and BBC are also talking about this. They have more resources, they have more journalists, they have more capacity to fight you. So fighting them is significantly harder, right? But also, it is just already hard because they just have an established reader base. So most likely if you are a random independent journal in Hungary, you as a Western reader don't know if this is actually trustworthy, you don't know the track records, which you have none of the BBC. So it is very hard for you to compete because you don't have that established reader base and people don't want to do all of this research for all of these countries, right? Because there's still other countries with independent researchers. It isn't clear why they would necessarily go for you as the Hungarian one over maybe, I don't know, the Bosnian one or the Austrian one or the Dutch one who don't have this kind of thing. So I don't know why you have the capacity. Why are you more likely to get this on, for example, social media? I think more people consume time on social media. It is on your phone, it is everywhere. It is really nice and really addictive. We are all times on Instagram watching all of these videos, but also there's significantly more people on it. Why do you then get money if you're going to get these people? I just think, firstly, at the moment you're able to actually give these stories and make them intriguing. People are much more likely to be willing to, for example, link on the articles themselves and, for example, pay for them because they see it more often, right? At some point they're going to be like, yes, I've seen The Economist a couple of times and I have like 2 free articles, but actually I want to read maybe more of them. So it's easy for you to get in the first place. But also, you just get more sponsors, right? On the free articles you have ads, you have, for example, like sponsored content that you can do on social media. So therefore you're going to get significantly more money. Why is it that you're only with biased news are able to break in the social media bubble? Firstly, algorithms push for biased and extreme news in the first place. It is the fact that at the moment you have a stronger reaction where you either hardly agree or harshly disagree that you're going to interact with that. You're going to place comments where you're going to say this is dumb or this is bad. But also you're going to have more reaction context where there are people reacting to it, and then they're going to also see you and have this name recognition with you. And this is important for your social media sites because at the moment that you engage with these people, that is the moment that you're going to have more people watching these ads on the social media sites. That's how they're able to retain this viewer base, which is why you're able to get it. But secondly, biased news is easier to put in short term than having this short like form such as reels or like Facebook posts than this when you're doing impartial. Why is this? Firstly, if you are impartial, you're going to need to ask different people what their opinions are and need to reflect it in the news piece. Literally, you have longer articles in the first place, or you have longer videos, where you have like, one person says something, the other person also says something. That is significantly disengaging because it is longer and people want to scroll quickly. But also, it is just a significantly higher burden, right? Because you try to expect maybe more on the things that you're talking about. But also, it is hard to compete on because everyone can tell you about the attack that happened or the policy the government put through. But not everyone can give you this opinion piece which is biased, where you can do a short form, where you can be like, the government is doing all of these bad things, and therefore you're going to get away with this. That is significantly easier when you're going to this bias. I'll take closing.
Yes, if you wanted to post, to get most AdSense post clickbaity content, why just don't make a tabloid?
A what?
A tabloid.
A tabloid. Media company. I don't know if tabloids are part of media companies, but also here's the thing, right? The problem is it might have started good, right? You might have just wanted to find an idea, but oftentimes you just need to compete. The ones who are able to survive the market are the ones who are going for this money in the first place. If you are trying to be like a good winning person, you are oftentimes a one journalist in your one blog and that kind of stuff. To make it in the market, you need to compete, you need to be ruthless, you need to get money. The free market is good. Why do you have the first thing? I want to know, you need to identify what these things in the first place. I want to know if you're going to give structural reasons why actually people don't like the government, which is assertive open government. Firstly, note at the moment you have technocratic autocrats, and their best case you have OO. Oftentimes they're really just groups who are oppressed by the government, who don't have as much vote, who are generated by their own analysis. But also note these governments are poor. They are unable to provide you social networks. They have infrastructure which is lacking. You don't have the roads to your school, or you don't have the school in the first place. Which means you are oftentimes left behind. Which means that oftentimes people are inherently very polarized. And at the moment that you're going to go in favor of the government, it's really hard because you have this news pundits and you have this like state media that you are already competing with. But it's easy for you to now go against opposition. And it's easier for you to now have these people who are willing to now give this money, vote for these reasons, structural reasons, vote CG.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'll now have the member up to communications here over here.
Thank you.
Independent news agencies, or the landscape of journalism is filled with polarized news agencies, biased reporting, and fake journalism across the board. It's formed by individuals that have a need to tell the truth. These are ambitious few that take a risk on doing something that is impartial, that is unique in a landscape that we live in. Notice, we have a polarization of the media across the world for the last 60 years or so. Since the Republican and Democrats have gotten like traditional voting and stuff like that, that means that now you have biased agencies across the board. That means that you cannot push for independence. This means that profit is far less important than the goal that you took when you formed a news agency. This takes CJ's case completely out of this debate. Why? Because there is much more profitable things that you can do as a journalist than doing the independent news thing. Why? Because it's incredibly expensive to do impartiality, because it takes much more proofreading to get the article right than if you're doing something biased where you just have to splander a couple of words and then you are biased. But also it takes much more due diligence, and it's much more boring to write articles that last like 10 pages on a legislative measure that is going to be adopted rather than saying a clickbaiting article and stuff like that. Notice, independent agencies are small collectives of truth-seeking individuals for the majority of cases. We're talking about like Southern News in Serbia, an independent news agency, because it's not funded by any political party or by any private individual. It's funded by its work that is being. We're not talking about fucking CNN here, because CNN is not a part of this debate. Right? So notice, these individuals that form the independent news agency, they took a risk. They choose to be independent. They choose to work for lesser pay. They educate themselves to perfect their craft in doing impartiality. Because notice, it's easier to get the job at The Sun rather than at the BBC, because BBC expects a degree of impartiality. It expects a degree of professional courtesy and ethical codex to be respected when you're doing journalism. Now notice, independent media can critique the ruling party when there is ample evidence of that. Meaning, when the police comes out with a report that there is a corruption scandal, impartial media can also cover it to a fuller extent. But the question is, when you're actively biased, how do you report on these matters? And I'm going to give you a characterization. So firstly, there is a change in the language that is used when you're talking about these articles. But there is a change also in the stories that you pick and choose to, give time to in the news media. And also, there is a change on what you frame as the main problem. So how does this bias look like? It looks like you can chase stories that are going to fulfill the role of you actively going against the governmental regime. This means that it's not enough to do day-to-day pieces on what's going on in the government, but rather having to spend time investigating on something that is going to grab attention. Because you're actively, how do you say, competing for attention with other parts of news agencies that exist. Notice this is an active motion. This is not that all news agencies should be independent. This is we, as an independent news agency, should go, how do you say, biased against. So this means that you have to waste time finding dog shit stories that people are privy to, how do you say, read when they're not doing something cool in their life anymore. So what type of stories are these? This is literally tabloid pieces. This is journalists doing paparazzi work, shooting evidence that they're eating at a restaurant and they're spending their money at the restaurant. This looks like them fabricating evidence of some corruption scandals with no accountability, because if you're impartially against the ruling party, they're going to chase you no matter what you do, so might as well fabricate evidence when doing so. But also it looks like critiquing even the good policies, even the policies that are going to bring net benefits to the people in your country. You're finding ways to critique it, you're finding ways to dismantle it. But also more importantly, you have to glorify your position when you're going against the governmental regime. Why do you have to do so? As a means of critiquing the government, you have to have some kind of anchoring point. That anchoring point is often a political tool, such as the opposition party, that you use to kind of attack the ruling party as well. Notice, in order to attack these leaders, you have to kind of align with some side. This means firstly that you're losing your independence in doing so, but secondly, more importantly, you're also, how do you say, pressuring yourself to glorify somebody that is often also corrupt. Meaning me as an individual have to glorify people that are entrenched in the same political system for the past 20 years or so. This is how this regime looks like. But also, you know that these individuals that you have to glorify now have made deals with the current regime, have made some concessions, have dropped some big important political points in the previous round. If nothing, I cannot be impartial over this. But also, this means that I'm doing the lowest form of journalism there is. The journalism that is true, that is attention-seeking, just literally like a prostitution of journalism. Because I'm selling to the highest bidder. The highest bidder now is the opposition that is going to pay me to run this story. This means that I'm sacrificing my ethical codex. And this is something that people are like, oh, you taught the ethical codex at your faculty. Guys, ethical codex is what anchors me and my personality and my identity. This is what I'm proud of. I'm proud of actually doing something that I believe is morally justified. If I'm not reporting impartiality, if I'm not reporting against the biases that are, how do you say, like intuitive to me, I'm then sacrificing my ethical codex. I then lose my pride that I have gained, that I have invested so much time in. Because people have long careers. They have 20 years of being impartial, now they switch and do this. This is fucking awful.
Right. So this case is not comparative. All your harms still exist because when you're impartial, you aren't able to do these policies or do good journalism because of the structural reasons.
Oh yeah, you give no proof of why I'm unable to do impartiality on your side of the house. I believe I'm plenty good of doing impartiality on my side of the house. I just don't have to use the fucking language of the sun when I'm reporting on legislative policy and stuff like that. Notice, why is this the most important thing? Because, firstly, me as an independent news agency have a moral duty towards the people inside of my collective that are the reason of my existence. Meaning, they have sacrificed their time, their effort, their energy, their cash into protecting what is now this independent news agency. If I have to pressure them into abandoning their craft, into doing prostitution journalism, I'm sacrificing them and violating this moral duty to withhold this contract that was made when we formed this independent institution. But also it harms our integrity as journalists inside of the agency. Because it harms you forever. You can never go back to being an impartial journalist once you've been partial for 20 or more years. But it also forces the collective to get into the mud, to do the dog fighting for a story, to do something that is seen as unrespectable by all. This is terrible. We stand proudly for it.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now the government will conclude today's government message.
Korzystając z okazji, że się nagrywa, to słowa do wszystkich dobrych chłopaków. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. I'm really glad about two things. First, that Poland is no longer mentioned in this info slide, but secondly, that it was in the past, and I know that all of the people in this debate are lying. Two pieces of framing why all of the context in this debate is not actually relevant, how these governments are actually working, and how the societies are actually working. Starting with the governments. These governments are not so fucked up as most of the people here are telling. They are not having that much of a capacity to actually changing things. They are just stretching the rules to the fullest, but they still want to be perceived good firstly by the people, because people are still voting. You have still control of elections. You can manipulate these elections to some extent. You can encourage some group of voters and so on, but people are still voting at the end of the day. And secondly, you want to be perceived good by the international area, by the organization that making sanctions on you, by the, for example, as a Hungary, by the European Union for maintaining the relationships on the international area and so on. What it means that you need an explanation to everything that you are doing, and you need a legit reason to sell to people why you are doing certain things later. So people are expecting you to act in a certain way. That means usually the governments in these countries are populist with a strong values, and they are pretending to be good and democratic and for the people. What that means that shutting down is unlikely on both sides of the house, and this is the least probable impact in this debate. Why is that? For reasons. Firstly, this is one of the democratic principles. If you are shutting down all of the independent media in your country, that is making very clear sign for the international area that you are not democratic, and that is when all the sanctions will go over all over your country. You are never going to do this. Secondly, there's going to be huge backlash and protest from the people. You want to have peace in your country because this is when you can just rule this country. You don't want people to go on the streets because then all of the international area is looking on you, and all of these people are getting mad at you. Thirdly, your voters are getting mad. Your voters expect you to behave in a certain way. They're expecting you to be democratic. They believe that you are actually democratic. That means that also them are getting mad, and that means that you are not going to shut out these companies on both sides of the house. But secondly, society is super polarized. Whenever anything is telling you about middle ground and being objective, they are lying because these people are not existing in these countries. Why is that? Few reasons. This government is inherently polarizing people. How they are doing this? For reasons. Firstly, they are manipulating emotions of the people by the news and by the stories that they are telling. That means that they are making the narrative about we are protecting people from certain threats, we are protecting people from the dangers such as immigrants, such as LGBTQ propaganda or something like this. They are manipulating emotions in a really, really strong way. You are not in the middle of do I hate gay people or do I not hate gay people? You are either on one or the second side. Secondly, you have huge propaganda and manipulating data and events. That means that most of these countries are having their own huge government propaganda, and they are doing a lot of manipulating how the events are actually working. That means that you are either believing the government or you are not believing the government, and you are thinking that they are inherently wrong. Thirdly, you have huge ideologies. There are no centers in these countries because these ideologies are so polarizing, and you cannot just be, I don't really know, you have to have opinions. And fourthly, people are establishing their identities around the politics. That opposition is a total opposition. You are not opposing what kind of policy we should make, but how the country should function. That means that when people are establishing their identities over that, there are no middle ground. What does it mean to the debate? Firstly, this is way better rebuttal than OG is providing you. They are just saying, oh, maybe polarization is good. I gave you actual reasons. And secondly, it's strengthening the uniqueness of our argument. Only on our side, we can actually make these people read this news, identify with this news, and this cannot happen on the opposition side. Now going to direct comparison, first starting with our opening. Our opening is making you one huge case about sponsors from Western companies. Why our case about money and the views from the people is more important. First, panelists see that they've never proved incentive and tipping point and comparative. When they are telling that Western countries want to have influence in your country and want you to be democratic, probably on their side, they still if there is the only alternative is this objective media, whatever that is, they are probably still going to find it to some way. So they never proved you why is this an actual tipping point. But secondly, they've never proved the capacity of the sponsors to enter all of bigger than their scale. What does it mean and why we are winning with our opening? First, you are way more certain. Our argument doesn't have the burdens that they are not meeting. On our side, people are engaging with this media, you are getting this money, you are getting this views. But secondly, this is just bigger impact. News makes sense only when people are reading this and when people are engaging with that. Only on our analysis we are actually getting like analysis why people are going to engage with that, and then they can make use of this media. Like doing media for people not to read it, this is just nonsense, nonsense thing. And now, like OWO is already killed by the framing and all of the stuff I've already said. And now going to CO. CO is like, you want to be independent and you are choosing to be independent. Firstly, you have views and you are probably also biased. Like when you are entering the independent media, that means that you are probably hating this government. Firstly, because you are not choosing the government media, and this would be probably easier for you. This would be probably more stable position for you, more stable job. You will probably earn more because this media is founded publicly and so on. If you are not choosing this in the first place and you are choosing your career as a journalist in this independent media, you probably hate the government. And also, all of the polarization analysis I've already gave you is applied to their case as well. So we think that this is just not true incentive that they are claiming, and we think this is way less important in this debate. But also, we think that money is logically prior to that. When they are saying, God, you don't really want this money and so on, we think that you need money for this media to function. You need money to actually hire these people. You need money to like be able to sustain yourself, to be able to create this news and so on. So we think that even if there's some weird journalist that doesn't really know if they hate government or not, and they are like kind of centrist, but I don't believe they exist, like still they need money to work, and only on our side they have this stable source of money. So therefore, we think we're winning this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now go on to today's debate. Welcome your speaker here.
I sit at my desk and the corruption scandal of opposition comes. I have to jump and defend a known tycoon who has stole from people for decades. After that, I have to write an article about how Vučić looks ugly eating a sandwich, and my soul withers because I have sold it to the algorithm. So, an OG point about impartiality. Look guys, impartiality literally means I can write whatever I feel like. If it is true, as CEO says, that I have some biases, what is important in our case is that those biases are actualized. Those biases which I actually have, which I actually identify biases being my personality, my code of ethics, my view of true policy, my view of what a good country is. Biases, also known as existence. So that is when I can actually do and talk all about these things, because I'm impartial, meaning I can talk about whatever I want. I do not have to defend the whole idea of strategically sometimes doing this and that. They never prove likelihood why this is the approach that we will take. Lucky explains to you in detail why these people are very passionate, very educated, and very determined in saying their own piece, their own truth, and this is what you should then be taking in this debate. Okay, so this whole idea of profit, and as CEO says, oh, profit is a prerequisite to any existence. if we prove that we still have some money and some funding, enough to pay us some decent living wages, but notice also that these people have probably like given up all of the luxury of life once they have decided to study and go into journalism, and then in a country which is in democratic decline, go into independent journalism, leaving both the government money on one side and most of the private money in big dependent companies on the other side. Just notice that before I do this. So, profit. I will take POIs around 5, so don't interrupt me. Profit. I'm still critiquing the government, and I'm still probably pro-democracy. Like most educated people, and they're probably college educated, if you decide to go into a dependent news company, are pro-democracy, meaning like some agency will give me money. On the other side, even if I'm anti-democracy, some agency will give me money because there is like Chinese, other big investors from like China, if I'm in Serbia, from Turkey, Balkan Info in Serbia, Google it, they have shit for a ton of money reporting on aliens. Whoever. So, secondarily, when I compete with funding with other independents and with big media privates. This is also a response to OG. So as that goes, the piece is small when baby divides the pie. There is a lot of independent companies competing for this foreign funding, and there is not infinite money that the EU is just throwing into random independent companies in these countries. Meaning that on both sides of the house, the amount of money I'm getting from those funds are pretty small. Insofar as I unlock some new funds, I'm not sure what the profit margin to that extent is. No, I'll take it later. But also, when CEO says, oh, but I get to write clickbaity articles and get money from AdSense or whatever, notice that I'm always beaten in amount of clickbait by big private anti-government companies, which cannot be shut down on that side of the house because they are literally, it would be an international scandal if I shut down, I don't know, N1 in Serbia. I only know examples of Serbia, I don't watch Turkish TV, I'm so sorry guys. Because this is like a known big international private institution, you're attacking a private investor's profit, you will never do that. This means that they have more money, better production, more advertising and more journalists, meaning they can pump out more clickbait articles, always taking away those people who just want a biased anti-government view. But this is our comparative advantage. This is something, and CEO does not prove this dependent bigger part, which is crucial to this argument. This is where we have comparative advantage. We give it to all of those relatively reasonable people who do realize that the opposition leaders are not the best, who have lived through the years when they were government that had corruption, who know that they are also entrenched into this political system, and most of them are well-college educated individuals who were working for foreign companies, who are willing to pitch us some money to continue existing, unlocking these so fucking important profits. So, now, why is profit just less important to me as a worker in this company? Look, I have CEO just like sees company and think profits. Look, like I'm independent in a corrupt country, working for the government to give me more money. I do politics and not celebrity reporting, doing like celebrity things will give me more money. I have, so these journalists must be motivated by something else. By what? They have seen for years corruption and injustice done on both sides of the house, both on those who are opposition and both on those who are governments. They have seen terrible clickbait articles talking about Erdogan looks ugly eating a sandwich, and they have felt sick to their stomach, and that is why they did not go to that big dependent. They have studied history, they know about how policy is complicated and grey, how you don't, it's not always the gap good opposition, gap bad opposition good, how many politicians have intricate scandals, and they know that this concrete part is being underreported into their country. This is what motivates them. This is why they opened this up. They did not do it to garner the most profit, so we've proven enough profit to existence. There is something more important to existence, and that is your justice, your truth. Yes, closing.
If there are many news organizations that bias because it's easy, you are most likely one of these countries who could just only talk about governments, ignore the opposition parties, or talk about the
I'm the unique company who has the choice. This is the debate in motion. Okay, so comparing to our opening, like they never really proved as government attacks have like the sort of capacity to be shut down, but also notice how powerful this regime has to be to shut you down specifically. Like number one, you are one of many different independents who is critiquing the government, and there is no single independent. So what comparative advantage does government have over shutting down you over anyone else? I'm I'm not so certain. Secondarily, you're only one of their critiques. Even if they shut down all independence, as I have proven, independence still exists. So why am I expending political points on while I'm still critiqued on both sides of the house? And guys, news of killing journalists, that's a really big fucking thing. Like, we will get fucked by EU, international partners, all of these things, CEO says. So, bottom line is, these semi-autocrats have to choose their fights. And I'm never sure why they will choose a fight which brings them absolutely nothing. So they will not prove this. Profit, they never prove, like marginal gains of profit. And as Emile says, we say there is something much more important than profit to people. And legacy, they never prove to you why you feel like this tarnishes your legacy so much. They just say, oh, but you don't feel so good because you can study in university, please. But it gives you much more detailed and nuanced analysis why this is the most important thing. But let's even weigh in on like closing. Notice that when you have decided to be independent company, you have accepted very high likelihood of closing down. Why? Because not having enough money is a very real thing for a company that does not know where its next fund is coming out. Meaning that like security and safety is not the main motivation. The main motivation was always truth. Only CEO gives the truth. Please vote CEO.
Very much for the speech, President. Across the floor, shake hands outside. I would like to all the panels, we've got a big ball, let's take 2 minutes, we'll do the ball and stuff.
Look.
Okay.